Hello, everyone. Welcome to Archeo Viking. Today, my frequent co-host or semi-frequent co-host, Ryan Denison, and I are going to cover, I would say, probably the most talked about subject in America. Period. The American Revolution.
Yeah, next to the Civil War. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And specifically, we're going to talk about uh, the lead up to the revolution, because oftentimes the lead up to the revolution is boiled down to essentially no taxation without representation, which was certainly a part of it, but was not the only part.
Right.
As well as
Big
the
oversimplification.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, as well as the after effects, and also the often overlooked, woefully so, and very wrongfully so, overlooked effects it had on the indigenous peoples of the Americas and African Americans as a whole. So, without a doubt, so everyone knows the Revolutionary War, and usually it's from movies like this right here, The Patriot.
Mm.
Uh, which in itself is very historically inaccurate, because Mel Gibson doesn't care, but but
Right.
but that's where we get the image: U.S. good guy, British a bad guy, and there's usually no nuance in between unless you're historians like Ryan and I. um, but again, as I said, it's not really so cut and dry. So, in order to get into the meat and to explain how the revolution was what it was, we have to go back to the beginning. So, with this, we're going to start with the origins of American individualism, because the colonies didn't all weren't always sort of the individualistic, parts of the empire that would eventually lead it to becoming the hotbed of revolution. And that brings us all the way back to the beginning of mercantilism. And this is where I'm going to pass it off to Ryan, because I understand a little bit of mercantilism, but it's not my main focus.
Right. Right. I mean, mercantilism is basically an early form of what today we call capitalism. It's based on trade. It's based on colonization. It's based on getting natural resources from certain areas and basically turning those into manufactured goods and selling them back around. What you've got there on the map is usually referred to as transatlantic trade, or some people probably heard of it as triangular trade,
Yep.
which is another oversimplification because they didn't necessarily go in a triangle and it was all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but kind of what you see is what develops during the 1600s, right? From about 1600, from Jamestown, 1608, 1609, to the 1700s. This is kind of what develops and what really helps Britain become kind of king of the hill for Europe. Essentially, it is, or the idea of mercantilism is basically those who has the most gold controls uh, the world. And Britain definitely is going to take a page out of the Dutch, which they're going to be at war with the Dutch three times during this
Mm-hmm.
1600s, and the British come out on top. Okay? Which is during the Second Anglo-Dutch Wars, where the British get New York, which was New Amsterdam at one point. Okay? But that's kind of mercantilism in a nutshell. It's this um, exploitation of areas for their natural resources and also people, right? Because we also have to mention the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade that develops during the period as well,
Mm-hmm.
which grows in more intensity during the late 1600s and early 1700s.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that had to do with, originally, the before enslaved Africans. Okay, not necessarily before, because they were used during this time as well, but before the enslavement of Africans became the primary form of enslavement used by the European colonies, the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the American Indian, Native American, depending on how you prefer to call them or yourself if you're one of these tribal individuals, um, was the shipping of enslaved indigenous peoples of the Americas across the sea, started by Columbus, but it really ramped up afterwards. And eventually, after wars because of this, especially the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee War, which were right after the other and were over the enslavement of indigenous peoples of the Americas, that's when you begin to see the ramping up of enslaved Africans being shipped because they were like, well, if we can't trust these people to not rebel, which, take that for what you will. Also, diseases were killing them off in droves. And things like that. And they were also not having very great success in wars with them anyway. Despite contrary belief and despite a person whom I rag on multiple times on my channel, Jared Diamond, in his stupid Guns, Germs, and Steel books, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were not in any way technologically less advanced than the Europeans, with the exception of the gun. And even then, they after being given the gun, they often preferred to still use the bow and arrow and the atlatl because they were more accurate than the muskets. They had a better firing rate, and they could still pierce the early European armor because, yes, Europeans up right until the 1630s still wore breastplates and helmets while using guns. So, which actually brings me to this. So, one of the reasons individualism in the Americas rose is because the U.S., sorry, not the U.S., the American colonies that would eventually become the U.S., much like India, were like the two extreme corners of the British Empire, essentially. And this led to them being sort of left to their own devices a lot. And this eventually, being left to their own devices led to the individualism, specifically in these colonial conflicts that I mentioned, starting really with the Pequot War, but it was more the Pequot War was a very one-sided war that was sort of instigated for a variety of reasons. I'll link my the real history of Thanksgiving in the iCard to explain that because I go into detail about that in that video.
Because the Narragansett and the Wampanoag are.
Well, yeah, but King Philip's War was not a one-sided war because of a sort of a pan-Indian alliance. A lot of people point to Pontiac's war with Pontiac and Neyland, which we'll talk about that in this video, forming a pan-Indian alliance to push them, quote-unquote, back to the sea. And that certainly was the first, the largest of them, or the first really big one. But really, one could argue that King Philip's War was that because the Narragansett and the Wampanoag, not the Narragansett fought with the British. The Wampanoag under King Philip, or Pomedicom was his real name, gathered all the tribes, as many of the tribes as he could in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, and started a massive war with the colonists for a variety of reasons. One, because of course they started breaking their treaties that his father had set forth. Also, they began murdering members of his tribe, and when he brought them to court, nothing really happened. They sort of ignored him. So just one, nail in the coffin after the other finally drove him to warfare. And really, the only reason he lost was, one, because the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, more commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, allied with the British for a variety of reasons, because they were the big man on the block in the north. And two, through just a stroke of luck, Pomedicom was actually one day running to a different village to gather more allies. And a British patrol with Narragansett allies happened to come across and see this man running, and they didn't realize it was Pomedicom, but they shot at him anyway and killed him. And then they realized afterwards it was Pomedicom, and without the leader, their leader, the alliance sort of crumbled. But through all of this, the British Crown never sent any professional troops. It was all the colonists. And this sort of goes with the Yamasee War and the Tuscarora War as well. They were sort of on their own or at least that's how they perceive themselves to be, and so that's why individualism began to rise anyway, um, and things like that. Furthermore, various civil wars began to rip apart England with um, the first English Civil War. The Glorious Revolution is called its own thing, but I would call it really the second English Civil War, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But because they were both essentially over the same thing. One involved, I forget the number, but Charles the whatever of England.
Charles the First.
Thank you, Charles the First. And then uh, the Glorious Revolution involving James III and then William III and etc. And really, they both boiled down to this essentially grudge match that had been brewing since Henry V. Sorry, not Henry V, Henry VIII, between the Church of England that he created and the Puritans, and between those two factions and the Catholic Church, and eventually be through these two civil wars that left the colonies completely on their own. The Puritan and English Church of England won out, essentially ending in the death of Charles I and James III. So, and there's that, and then also a variety of conflicts that happened that really the colonies never got anything out of. For one thing, there was the 30 Years' War, which is not this map, and really it didn't affect the colonies anyway. They could have cared less, because really it was just a grudge match between all the countries in Europe over, again, religion. And it was the actual reason that the Pilgrims fled to America, not the thing you hear about religious freedom, because they had religious freedom in the Netherlands. They stayed.
Most people don't realize that they left from the Netherlands and not from, at least on the Mayflower.
And the Netherlands, not from Britain. Yep, and Governor Bradford mentions it very clearly in his journals, which again, I have that in my 2 videos on the actual history of Thanksgiving, that one of the reasons they left, other than not wanting their British children to intermarry with the Dutch, was that the 30-year truce that had been going on between Spain and the Netherlands was about to end, as well as the ramping up of the 30 Years' War. But while that had no effect on them, a very similarly sized colonial war did, and that was the War of Austrian Succession, which essentially was really, it's a good analogy for World War One. Essentially, the Austrian two people, he
gets everybody to agree to let his daughter take the throne. Then when she takes the throne, everybody, no.
Maria Theresa is crowned the heir of the Austrian Empire, and then the rival or decides no, he doesn't want that. And so, much like World War One, where people were left picking allies, and also like the 30 Years' War, where countries would decide to just pick allies and make coalitions, this began to happen. However, unlike the 30 Years' War, and much like the World War One, this actually became a semi-global conflict, not as big as a couple of conflicts we'll talk about in a little bit, but it was on that level. And amongst these conflicts were King George's War, which led to Britain, the colonies, getting a hold of the Acadian Peninsula in Canada from France, one of the countries that had allied with the Spanish side of the Habsburg family, and also the War of Jenkins Ear, which essentially, to explain the War of Jenkins Ear, it's called the War of Jenkins Ear because of a British sailor named Jenkins who did have his ear chopped off by the Spanish literally 10 years before the War of Jenkins Ear, and nobody cared then. But then the War
of kept it in a jar.
He kept it in a jar, and then the War of Austrian Succession began wrapping up, and Britain needed a public reason as to why to go to war with Spain, and so they paraded Jenkins throughout the capital of London, and were like, see what the Spanish did to them. This is why we have to go to war with them. And so they waged war with them and all over the Caribbean that you see here, as well as in Georgia and Florida, because the governor of Georgia, James Oglethorpe, actually tried to invade Florida and laid siege to St. Augustine, but he could not take it and was forced to return. to Georgia, where then the Spanish then promptly invaded Georgia, and James Oglethorpe defeated the Spanish at the battles uh, Bloody Marsh and Gully Hole Creek, um, with actually see here, forget which one was first. The um, Bloody Marsh was second, but either way, and really a lot of it also had to do with help from the Creek, the Yamacraw Creek Indians, as well as the Scottish and Irish mercenaries that they had there, rather than the British. But either way, he defeated the Spanish and sort of solidified Georgia as a colony. But eventually, when the war ended, the Acadian Peninsula and the lack of gains from these wars in Florida and the Caribbean angered the colonists because they gained nothing. Again, Acadia was given back to Spain, and the campaigns in the Caribbean and in Florida resulted in nothing. So they put their lives on the line for literally nothing.
Yeah, when they thought they had seized land in Acadia and thought they were going to hold to it, and then it just goes back to the French and the ensuing peace treaty.
Yeah, exactly.
Not too happy colonists.
No. And so it was after this, the colonists sort of this is when the colonists sort of already began to look for a different form of government, and they looked no farther than to their north, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which was originally a set of 5 tribes consisting of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. But after the Tuscarora War, the Tuscarora migrated en masse to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, where they were inducted into the Confederacy as the 6th equal tribe. And many of the founding fathers basically immediately began to look to this. Now, it did help that a Haudenosaunee emissary, Constantino, visited Albany in 1744 and said, "Hey, why are you calling us so divided? You should be like us." But that was really about it for those 7 years, until Benjamin Franklin, where he, in a letter to James Parker, talks about why they should look to the quote unquote Indians for inspiration.
Yeah, and
now
he's going to come back to this again.
Yeah, all of them will. Now, yeah. I will say that he was still not a nice person, and he was still very much racist against the indigenous peoples of the America. But he did say it would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages, again, he was still racist, forming a scheme for such a nation, will be capable of forming a scheme for such a nation and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted for ages and appears indissoluble, and yet that, like a union, should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies to whom it is more necessary and more advantageous, and who cannot be supposed to want an equal understanding of their interests. Which essentially is him saying, why can they do it, but we can't? And then he goes into a tirade about how the Indians are horrible people. Again, he's not a great person, but the point is of this excerpt, which I will include in the sources, is that he was still looking to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for inspiration, and he did eventually use it in the creation of the Albany Plan, the sort of predecessor to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. A lot of people like to look at the Magna Carta, but I take issue with that because the Magna Carta had been in use for 400 years, and for 400 to 500 years.
When you talk about the English Constitution, it's just this whole series of documents and tradition, and they look back to that. But the American influences, with the Albany Plan of Union, you get clear distinction to that. And
they make it clear later. Yeah, and they make it clear way later as well. So I take issue with the whole Magna Carta because they already knew about the Magna Carta. Why would they go back to something they were trying to leave? But anyways, furthermore, Benjamin Franklin is the person who put this image, created this image, the join or die image, which was about the Albany Plan.
Yeah, it is was not about the American Revolution.
No.
That's another. I get this all the time with this political cartoon and dispel myth. This is right before what is the big deal break, or kind of the big deal breaker, is going to lead to the big deal breaker between the British and the colonies, and that's the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War.
Yeah.
And this is Franklin's answer to what happens before that, which I think we go into next slide. So I don't want to really predicate that.
And it was
this is the Albany Plan of Union.
Yeah, he was the Albany Plan of Union. That's exactly what it was. He's like, we need to unite together for this cause, and that brings us to the causes of the revolution. And one of the big causes, the biggest cause, was the 7 Years' War, which was the true first war
immediate cause, right?
Yeah, and it was the true first World War.
Right, and it really is. It is a world conflict. A lot of this is also predicated, at least long-term cause of the revolution is what we call salutary neglect. SALUTARY, neglect, and it is this kind of British policy that it was on and off during the 1600s. That, as we mentioned before, they pretty much left the colonies alone as long as the money flowed in. Which allowed the colonies to develop things like the House of Burgesses in Virginia in 1619, and different ideas on representation in government. And then you have the wars that we already mentioned, the War of the League of Augsburg, kicking up with the 30 Years' War, the War of Austrian Succession. Those are kind of building up to this conflict. And this conflict is the one that really highlights the differences that have developed between the colonies and the British.
Yeah, and it's essentially, and it was started literally on accident. So essentially what happened was they sent a young George Washington, who was at the time a very unexperienced commander. I believe he was only a major at the time, or a colonel, give or take. And he was sent literally just to survey the Ohio Valley. That's all he was sent to do. And he made a sort of an agreement with a Seneca chief named Tonagreeson. However, Tonagreeson was getting tired of both British and French encroachment on his territory. However, the British at the time were offering a better deal, and so he sided with the British. And so he, sort of at his urgings, led an ambush on a French contingent with George Washington, and killed most of the French contingent, and started the 7 Years' War. Now, again, this was sort of on accident because because Washington had no idea this was going to happen. And I want to make this clear. This is not to paint the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as whole-on villains, because that statement, there's a chance that some guy is going to see they were horrible. No, Tonagreeson was a singular man within the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and he had his own interests, like everyone else.
We say about history, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated, and things like that. And then because of that, it just sort of exploded, eventually including really a lot of people who aren't even on this list. But on one side, Britain, Prussia, Hanover, and Hesse, people who would eventually join Britain in the American Revolution. We'll get to that in a little bit. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Portugal, Brunswick, Schaumburg, as well as temporarily tribes such as the Cherokee. And then on France side, you had Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Saxony, and the Mughal Empire. Was really the only major political entity at the time not included being the Qing dynasty of China, and that's because they themselves were undergoing a very long civil war called the White Lotus Rebellion, which is also part of why the Qing dynasty, which at one point in time was kicking the ass of Russia, and its predecessor, the Ming dynasty, had defeated the Portuguese, Dutch, and Spanish, was no longer able to hold up to European powers. But that's a whole nother video that I'm going to cover later. But the whole point is it covered the whole world, and one of the major one of the two major points of campaigning was in the Americas, involving a lot of things like the siege of Fort Duquesne, which is why the Cherokee eventually switched sides. Well, one of the reasons why the Cherokee eventually switched sides, and various other things. But eventually, Britain, with its set of allies, was able to come out on top.
Yeah, yeah. Sir William Pitt was the prime minister at the point, and he's the guy that makes the decision to
Yeah,
focus on North America. And that, of course, has a lot of repercussions, but that's where he decided to focus, mainly because that's where they wanted more land grab.
yeah. Oh, and I forgot to mention the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire also didn't play a part in it either. It was another major power that was sort of left out, but it had its own affairs, such as constantly trying to take more land in Europe from Austria.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Um, but anyways, eventually the effects of the 7 Years' War on the indigenous peoples of the America led to a couple of major, there were more, but the two biggest conflicts that happened between Britain and the indigenous peoples of the Americas in the wake of the 7 Years' War was first the Anglo-Cherokee War, where essentially, because of how long the campaign to Fort Duquesne took, uh, combined with many of the Cherokee, as they were on their way home, being ambushed by colonists for a variety of reasons. One, the Cherokee decided to take horses that they felt was payment for their campaign, but also uh, whether it would be due to not recognizing their tribe or not caring, uh, a law that had been passed by the British government that paid for scalps of tribes such as the Shawnee and such who were on the French side. They decided to attack the Cherokee to get those scalps and to get the bounty because, of course, no one in the British cared really. And so he'll eventually ending in the death of about 30 men. And again, I do a video on this in much more detail, but essentially this led to, first, the Cherokee legitimately tried to settle this peacefully. They sent emissaries and, hey, what the fuck? We need to handle this civilly. We're your allies. Can we fix it? And really, the colonies, due to the miscommunication between North Carolina and South Carolina, with North Carolina being like, hey, stop it, you need to fix this, and the governor of South Carolina being incompetent and arrogant, a war started, especially after the capture of several important Cherokee chiefs who were sent as emissaries for peace, such as Ottakulakula, a very prominent Cherokee chief who had actually visited England in the 1740s. And so a war broke out, resulting in 3 British expeditions, with 2 of the expeditions ending in absolute utter failure, with the Cherokee slaughtering most of them. And then the 3rd expedition under Colonel Grant marched in, met no resistance, burned a couple of villages, marched back, and was harried the whole way by Cherokee ambushes. And then once he got back, he's like, I won, kind of, which wasn't really, especially considering the Cherokee and many tribes developed those tactics specifically to fight the British. In other words, they originally hid in well-constructed forts when rival tribes would be fighting, as a way to mitigate things, combined with the typical ambush tactics, but they used forts specifically because they knew how well they worked. But when the introduction of cannons, they decided, okay, we need to change the game, and so they decided, let's take to the woods and use our knowledge of the terrain to avoid them and attack them when we so chose. So really, if you look at that, think about it that way, and think about how nobody was in those villages, or little to nobody, there were still some, and the ambushes that they conducted on Brant's armies as he was leaving Cherokee territory, that's not a victory on the British side at all. That's a victory for the Cherokee. A Pyrrhic victory, because those villages did lose them, cost them a lot of food, as well as disease, but a victory nonetheless. And then you have Pontiac's War, where the I believe it was a Wyandotte, the Wyandotte chief Pontiac, along with
Ottawa.
Ottawa. Thank you, Ottawa. Yeah, Ottawa chief Pontiac and the Ottawa prophet Nealon united the
Oh,
various tribes of the Union.
Squatawa.
No, Tenskwatawa was Tecumseh's brother.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Yeah,
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 you're right.
yeah. Tenskwatawa was Tecumseh's brother. Nealon was the prophet who was
You
Pontiac.
might have, hold on. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah, and they united basically all the tribes that Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa would unite into a confederation, and they attacked every British fort in what would become known as the Ohio Territory, and
Mhm.
fought the British to a standstill. And because of this, because of the Anglo-Cherokee War and Pontiac's War, eventually an event known as the Proclamation of 1763 would happen, where England decided, all right, we're done. We've fought to exhaustion against the French and all their allies. We've lost the Anglo-Cherokee War, though we're going to call it a victory, and we fought Pontiac's Confederation to a stalemate. We're just gonna, yeah, and lack of money. Thank you, lack of money. Yeah, which we'll get to in a minute. I was going to say that for later, but so we're going to create this boundary called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which basically says that nobody in the colonies could settle past those boundaries without permission. Because you could get permission, but it was incredibly difficult to get permission because you had to get permission
Right,
from both sides of the boundary.
right.
Of course, as we'll talk about in a little while, the colonists didn't always listen. But essentially, this um, led to this, and partially because of this, the colonies began to become very angry. This was not the only one. This was one of their main ones, but it made them very angry. One, it made the lower class of the colonies angry because, again, yet again, in a conflict that they were fighting for a distant royal crown, they gained nothing. And then for the upper class, like George Washington and like in Jefferson and such, who, for example, Washington paid for like 500 to 1,000 acres worth of land that he kept during the war. He kept buying from people who had bought the land so that he could increase his holdings. Now all those were thrown out the door. So essentially, it was for the lower class, we've gained nothing, and for the upper class, no, we can't have a small country anymore. So, and then in colonies like South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina, you had, in the same vein of a distant crown, you had events like large smallpox outbreaks and various slave rebellions, such as, well, sort of, Stono's Rebellion was about 30, yeah, 30 years before this, but they also began to have other slave rebellions happening because of the 7 Years' War and the Anglo-Cherokee War, as well as the development of what are called maroon colonies, or colonies of escaped slaves who escaped and built free colonies of their own. And so, because of all of these together, the colonists, this is where the colonists really began to be infuriated at the crown. Uh, they were already sort of annoyed at the crown for the other things that we mentioned, but this was where they really began to get mad because of the Proclamation of 1763, um, the and the lack of help for pandemics, and because of their fear that basically they would the whole surveillance insurrection thing.
Yeah,
Supposedly, if
yeah,
slaves escaped, they would wipe out all of humanity.
right. And
Uh,
those years, that 1763 to 1776, I focus a whole lot in my classes because those are the critical years
yeah,
building up to the American Revolution.
yeah,
And just the going from this victory in the 7 Years' War, and the majority of the colonists were rah rah rah. We're part of the largest empire in the world. Rah rah Britain, and then only 13 years later, we've got the Declaration of Independence. But there were already cracks in the relationship before
yeah,
that 13-year period. But this is where it finally breaks
yeah.
apart.
And it was very much sort of aggravated by our next point, the Age of Enlightenment. Now, the Age of Enlightenment had been going on since the late 1600s, but really the Age of Enlightenment really began to take off around in those years between the 1760s and 1776, with it started originally by people like John Locke, who felt everyone could govern themselves, but then expanded upon by American Enlightenment philosophers like Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin. Ryan, why don't you give a little explanation of what the Age of Enlightenment was all about?
Oh, well, all right. So, in a nutshell, this big, huge topic.
Yeah.
So you've got going back, and usually when we look at it in American history, we look at how it influences government and how it were government ideas, government philosophies, and going back to like Thomas Hobbes with his Leviathan and John Locke, we start to see the development of this idea of natural rights. Locke's comes up with his three: life, liberty, and property, which he talks about a little bit later. We'll say that both Hobbes and Locke are writing about the English Civil War with Charles I and the philosophy behind where power comes from, right? And so if the English Civil War basically destroys this idea of divine right, and Hobbes and Locke are saying, well, if the power doesn't derive from the creator, or God, and most of those guys in the Enlightenment are going to be deists, so they probably refer to it as the creator. Then where does it come from? And Hobbes is the first to basically posit that the power of government comes from the people. Locke expands on that about 30 years later. He's writing with a little bit more hindsight to the English Civil War, and in his what's sometimes called a treatise on civil government, he talks about how government has certain responsibilities and the people have certain responsibilities, and they enter into what we call a social contract. And through that, that's where power is derived from. People willingly give it over to the government. And so the people are the government, right? And this is kind of the whole idea behind, if you look at the frontispiece for Hobbes's Leviathan, you see this giant king over the land. And if you go in a little bit closer, the king's just made up of individual people, right? And so that's kind of where you see a lot of the basis of these ideas. Locke is also part of a group of people in England. Thomas Gordon is another one, who are called the Commonwealth men. And the Commonwealth men are highly critical of English government at the time. They write a series of scathing criticism of the English government, how corrupt it is, how you had rotten boroughs, basically, where the only person that could vote was the person, a member of parliament, that sort of thing. They rattle on about this idea of universal representation. It's kind of what the British had, that it's completely different than what we look at it as. We see it as direct representation. I elect someone from my area who represents us in government.
Yeah.
Whereas the British didn't do it that way. They felt that every member of parliament was a representative of all the subjects of the crown. And so when the colonists first start saying this, no representation or no taxation without representation, a lot of the English over there scratching their heads going, what the hell are you talking about? You've got representation. Yeah. Every member of parliament is your representative. What are you talking about?
Well, yeah. And
so
also
there's a disconnect there with that. So that's kind of what we talk about in U.S. history, or my U.S. history classes about the Enlightenment. Paine and Franklin, of course, are going to echo that and echo those ideas and really echo those criticisms of the English government. Those series of essays, Cato's letters, C-A-T-O apostrophe S, would have been on every American intellectual's library shelf. Yeah. They would have read all those. And so people like Paine, Franklin, Jefferson, they were very keenly aware of the problems of the British government as we're moving through this period.
Yeah. And also to be fair, like many French like sort of enlightenments and revolutionaries brought up, the American colonies had a lot more representation than many of the other colonies, including in the French at least comparatively.
Mhm.
So which sort of brings me to this: the various acts, like the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, and the Stamp Act. So before I explain what those are, essentially what it is to while they had, at least on paper, more representation than any of the other British colonies and any of the other um, French colonies and such. One, there was that the British Parliament didn't help with that whole universal representation spiel. Two, the wealthy landowners like Washington and Jefferson and such, who were still angry about not getting their land they had purchased, were sort of echoing these sentiments to the lower class. Doesn't that sound familiar? um,
Yeah.
and then these various acts happen. So essentially, what happened after this World War that was the 7 Years' War, which also actually lasted 9 years, which is funny. But the British Crown was ridiculously in debt. Like,
Right.
if there was a graph of how much money they lost, it would probably be a 90-degree angle to how much money they lost
Right.
committing this war. And so they had to increase taxes, at
Right.
least on paper, in order to pay for these.
Yeah, and one of the aspects that I always teach about this too is the British Parliament perspective,
Yeah,
because most people never get this unless you take specific college courses or you
yeah,
major in this stuff. They just kind of glaze over it. When you're looking at the British Parliament, obviously has a problem with debt, right? So they look at, can we tax our own people? Well, the people in England are already heavily taxed. And so then they look at elsewhere in their empire, and they're looking at the American colonies, which have done really well financially over the last 100 and some years. And I always use this article from Foreign Policy magazine called Tea, Taxes, and Revolution, because
yeah,
it highlights the fact that, and I'm just going to read, Britons, for example, pay 5.4 times as much in taxes as taxpayers in Massachusetts, 18 times as much as those in Connecticut, 6.3 times as much as those in New York, 15.5 times as much as those in Virginia, and 35.8 times as much as those in Pennsylvania. And so British Parliament is looking at this huge discrepancy in taxation, going, well, the colonies have got to pay their fair share.
yeah. And they start doing that, with, again, first the Sugar Act, and then eventually getting into the acts like the Stamp Act and the Tea
Right.
Act,
Right.
where they were taxing all these things, and it just kept making the uh, uh, American colonists angry. Again, predominantly the wealthy landowners
Right.
like
Right.
Jefferson and
Yeah.
Washington, but they were parroting those things down to the lower classes and
Right.
riling them up.
Right. And I always explain it this: the American Revolution is such an anomaly when we talk about revolutions, because it's kind of an oxymoron. It's a conservative revolution.
Yeah.
It's not anything about social revolution. It's not an economic revolution.
No.
It's purely political. And for instance, the Sugar Act doesn't really have the wealthy people get that act repealed.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act really solidifies the classes together because of the rhetoric of the upper classes coming down and the lower classes echoing it. And when everybody has to pay a penny tax on legal documents and
Mm-hmm.
things as innocuous as playing cards, that's really when the thing takes off. And you got the Stamp Act Congress is formed, and they send representatives to England to try to get it repealed, and eventually they're going to.
Mm-hmm. And that's another aspect of this is what you don't, again, like, unless you take college level courses, what you don't hear a lot of the time is how willing Parliament was to compromise with the colonists. They kept being like, okay, we'll take that away. It's like, but we have to get our money back somehow. You aren't paying your fair share. How about this act? And so it just kept happening, and compromise. Really, it eventually came down to King George, because again, the colonists and Parliament were actually, for the most part, willing to compromise, and were sort of had a back and forth. with as
Yeah,
much of this disparity.
the colonies even had advocates in British Parliament. I mean,
Yeah,
John Wilkes is one of the best known who sided with the colonists
yeah,
in yeah, then you've got, of course, there you go on the screen,
the
the Tea
Boston
Act,
Tea Party. Yeah,
which is also completely misunderstood because the act is for those of you that haven't got through this or through this narrative, the Tea Act of 1773 actually lowers the tax on tea, which had been held over from the Townshend duties, but it lowers the tax, and but it provides the British East India Company with a monopoly on
yeah,
tea in North America,
yeah,
and
and
that's
also
where the colonists really get upset, is this monopoly.
yeah, and also the. And all this kind of picture always makes me laugh because it looks like they're like dumping over like loose leaves. Tea
Yeah.
back then was actually in bricks because it's easier to ship. You can ship more per pound, and
Right,
it's
right.
actually easier to preserve. And they copied it from India and China, who had done it for that for many
Yeah.
years. But essentially, what happens is the Sons of Liberty, basically the story that we all know, the Sons of Liberty go on and dump these out. And you know
Oh, yeah. And another thing, this didn't happen quickly, right? This is like tons of tea. This would take at least 3 to 4 hours to do.
yeah, and it was actually also a lot more orderly than any movie or show talks about. It was not this mob. I mean, they were dressed up
Yeah.
in Indian garb, but maybe I question whether or not that actually happened.
Yeah, I do too.
But
The
still,
sources are very sketchy about that, and
yeah,
it's most of it are afterwards.
yeah. But either way, they go on as an orderly group and do it. However, another thing that people don't often hear is the founding fathers, all the heads of the movement that are going on, were actually against the Boston Tea Party. And one of the
Yes.
best examples, but not the only example, is Benjamin Franklin's letter to see here to the Honorable Thomas. No, letter to the British Crown, I believe.
Mhm.
And basically, he's saying, where does he say that? Um, but see here, he's essentially in this. You can pause and read it, but essentially in this, he says that we should. Oh yeah, there we go. You know, right here, he says. Only a few years since, when valuable sawmill which had been destroyed, a number of persons and such, he's like, a compensation was made out, and he's saying we should do this because of the Boston Tea Party. That's essentially what it was. Is he, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all of them were like, hey, the British East India Company is not who we have this dispute with. You shouldn't have done this. Let's pay them back for their property. I'm
Yeah.
truly concerned, as I believe all considerate men are with you, that there should seem to be any necessity for carrying matters to such extremity as in a dispute about public rights to destroy private property. This, notwithstanding the blame justly due to those who obstructed the return of tea, is impossible to justify with people so prejudiced in favor of the power of Parliament to tax America, as most are in the country. He's saying this was not what we should have done. It was too extreme.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that a lot of them, and this always cracks me up every time I hear this stuff in the media about, oh, the patriots and the founding fathers did, and as soon as someone opens their mouth and says it, I'm like, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, they wanted to pay they wanted to pay the British East India Company back their money because it was a private company and not the Crown, who they had their issues with.
Right. And at this point, Franklin's like Rupert Murdoch. He's like a media mogul of the whole colonies, newspapers up and down. If he lets this go, then what happens when people take out
Yeah,
one of his printing presses? Right.
yeah, exactly. Make sure. Okay, and then after this, this is they eventually began to sort of change their minds, and that was because of the Intolerable Acts, as well as the Intolerable Acts, which included the Boston Port Act, but most importantly, actually, the Quebec Act. And that's what I want to mention is the Quebec Act is essentially it made Quebec Canadian territory rather than U.S., the American colonies territory, and prevented them from settling there.
Right,
And
and
that really
that
infuriated them.
that and the British have learned their lesson about salutary neglect. We're not going to let Canada go the way of the American colonies on the Atlantic coast.
Yeah,
This is going to be totally different, which actually
exactly.
plays into the propaganda of the Sons of Liberty, who are also pushing this conspiracy theory that the British wanted to enslave Americans and
Mhm.
take and all this other stuff. We America, we have these huge hot themes that go through it. One, smuggling. We've always been smugglers, and two, we've always loved conspiracy theories for some reason.
And then of course, there's the very famous Quartering Act, which was an issue, but was also a little bit overblown. But still, it was essentially where they were uh, told that they had to give British soldiers shelter under certain circumstances and things like that. But again, it all really boils down to the Quebec Act, which they felt was the sort of last straw because they wanted that land in Quebec. Again, mostly people like Washington and Jefferson, who kept wanting to expand their wealth, uh, and it led them to eventually creating the Continental Congress that we see here.
Yeah, yeah. And the Massachusetts Government Act, I want to mention that one too.
Okay,
That abolishes the that current government that Massachusetts had and reforms it.
yeah, exactly. So all of these were, again, hence the name, intolerable to the colonists. And then eventually, this is where we get back to the where they were looking for new forms of government. They invited the Continental Congress in 1775, looking for new forms of government. Invited another Haudenosaunee uh, uh, diplomatic group to Albany again. Albany is a pattern you see where they invite people all the time. Um,
Mhm.
to meet with the Continental Congress. Um, and they talk about, uh, they say, your wise forefather and great council with which they held at Lancaster in Pennsylvania when Conosatigo spoke to us, the white people, in these very words: Brethren, we, the Six Nations, heartily recommend union and good agreement between you and our brethren. Never disagree, but preserve a strict friendship for one another, and thereby you, as well as we, will become the stronger. Our wise forefathers established union and amity between the five nations. This made us formidable. This has given us great weight and authority with our neighboring nations. We are a powerful confederacy, and if you observe the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power. Therefore, whatever befalls you, you will never fall out with one another. And the emissaries of the Continental Congress to the Haudenosaunee said, these words of Conosatigo, brothers, our forefathers rejoiced to hear Conosatigo speak these words. They sunk deep in our hearts. The advice was good, and then they go on for a while. So essentially, they're saying that they are already thinking about taking those words to heart. Now, I've heard counter arguments, and there's still debate about the influence of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy on the formation of the U.S. to this day. Most still lean to they most definitely had influence, but still there's that debate. And one of the counter arguments is like, well, what if they were paying lip service? And that's
Mhm.
certainly possible, but and I'll expand on why it's more likely there was influence later. But essentially, most of the evidence points to it wasn't lip service. This was them genuinely saying, we are considering taking your advice. And so they began to take this advice to heart. And then the war began to begin.
Mhm.
So the start of the war, uh, really, we all hear like, July 4th, 1776, but really the start of the war was earlier with the battles of Lexington and Concord.
Yeah.
We hear Paul Revere's route, which Paul Revere was involved, but he was I think one of like 10 different riders who went out.
Yeah, initially like three, and then it of course grew
Yeah,
as the
yeah,
night went on.
and it
And
was
this
not.
is another thing I love to
Yeah,
myth bust about, because what most people have learned in school actually comes from a poem written in 1860
yeah,
and not what actually happened that night.
yep. And there was no the British are coming at all.
Yeah,
Uh,
the British were already in Boston. If he'd
then
yelled this, he would have been, which he eventually does get arrested.
yeah, but not only that, they were all British. So the British are coming, and they would have been like, "Excuse me, like who are you talking about? Like me, you, like it was." They said that from what I understand, it was the regulars are coming, which makes sense because it was the professional British Army. And
Mhm.
eventually, because of his and others, again, it was I think it ended up being around 10 peoples. Um, Riding out and warning all the militias, the battles of Lexington and Concord ended in the colonists' victory, um, because the British were sort of this is another myth. They were sort of quote unquote on their way to get their guns, but really they were on their way to deal with these people who they had already heard were about to start an uprising, and the British in most imperial empires did not like uprisings, so they were on their way to deal with the uprising before it happened. It was not specifically just to get their guns. It was for a variety of reasons that eventually led to this battle. So, uh, and that's sort of what started the war, not the whole July 4th, 1776, though it does come into play later. And then also we have the Battle of Bunker Hill, which again was actually before the Revolution proper.
Mhm.
Um, and it ended in a British victory, but with it was again what we call a Pyrrhic victory, a
Yeah.
victory where they had more, they had a lot of losses, and it was to where the phrase comes from. The Pyrrhic victory comes from a early Iron Age Greek conqueror uh, named Pyrrhus, who, when he battled the burgeoning Roman Republic, he had won a variety of battles, but he kept losing more and more men. And he said, "Any more victory like this, and I will be dead and done for." And that's essentially where Pyrrhic victory comes from. Essentially, a victory that is so costly it might as well be a defeat. And
Right.
this eventually led to the Olive Branch Petition. And why don't you explain what the Olive Branch Petition essentially is?
Well,
Right.
this is one of the this is another thing where um, again people get this version of the American Revolution and they don't get all the details with it. Um, Even though we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the colonial leadership were not ready to leave the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
It's just too lucrative. All right, and the Olive Branch Petition is kind of this one of the last ditch efforts to try to find some compromise between Parliament and the colonies, and it's really kind of going to fall on deaf ears.
Mm-hmm.
Right. By this point, King George is solidified in his opinion, and when he receives the branch petition, he basically issues what's known as the Proclamation of Rebellion, and he is the one that declares the colonies in open rebellion, which then allows him to make give more military orders and stuff like that without the really the consent of Parliament. But the Olive Branch petition is one of those. And I mean, shortly after this, you also have the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, written by John Dickinson, that is kind of a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. There are a lot of these documents that never get mentioned in a regular U.S. history
Yeah.
class that the average person
Yeah. Yeah.
takes. I mean, for one, there's just not enough time, but you would
Yeah.
hope that the teacher in those courses would say, hey, there's all this other stuff that I can't mention that you
Yeah.
should look into one day. But
Yeah.
sometimes it doesn't happen.
Yeah. Well, again, going back on they sent emissaries to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and were like, "Hey, we need help forming this new government, or at least forming some semblance of it." And this brings me to another thing. So, be, right in concurrence with this time was another conflict was in the brewing, directly because of the Proclamation of 1763. Essentially, what happened was the very famous Daniel Boone had kept coming into what is now modern day Kentucky with several different expeditions, usually ending in him being driven out by the Cherokee and Shawnee and Miami tribes that lived in and around Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. Until eventually he, with a man named Henderson, I can never remember his first name, but a trader named Henderson, come into Kentucky and make an agreement with various Shawnee and Cherokee chiefs, known as the Transylvania Purchase or the Henderson Purchase. That really, that one purchased all of the swath of land right here between the Cumberland and Kentucky rivers and Green Rivers in modern day Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as a little bit of Ohio and Indiana. And it really angered a lot of the various Shawnee and Cherokee war chiefs, among them being Cornstalk and Dragon Canoe, an individual whom I've already done a very lengthy video on. And they started raiding these settlements in the Transylvania Purchase. A little bit later, immediately after the Transylvania Purchase, they were like, okay, fine, we'll listen to the words of the council and we'll ignore them after they had said, hey, this is not a good idea. They're not going to listen to the treaty. We've seen this happen before. This is a terrible idea. But they did it anyway. And then, of course, when the colonists inevitably started going into land that was not included in the purchase, that's when they began raiding. And they raided, they raided several settlements. And at one point, Cherokee chief named Hanging Maw, as well as several Shawnee warriors, captured Daniel Boone's eldest daughter, which they were promptly able to get back. But the igniting event was an event involving the Shawnee and the Cherokee, where a Shawnee chief's family, the chief being named Logan's family, was killed in a raid by Kentucky colonists. And so this infuriated him and many of the Cherokee, including Dragon Canoe, and so they began raiding even more. And this is eventually led to the Lord Dunmore, an individual who we'll talk about a couple more times later in the video, gathered several different militia groups and professional soldiers together and marched into the Kentucky-Ohio territory, starting what is known as Lord Dunmore's War. Eventually cornering the Cornstalk and many of his Shawnee warriors, as well as various Cherokee warriors, at the Battle of Point Pleasant. And this is where I take a little bit of an issue of what the British claim and what the accounts tell me as a historian. So the accounts talk about, the British claim that this was a victory. They quote unquote drove the Shawnee and Cherokee off the field. However, the British lost more forces, a lot more forces, and the Cherokee and Shawnee, I think, lost maybe like 20 or 30, and they then promptly left the field, with the British staying on the field. And so they claimed victory because they had been the ones who were left on the field. However, what this doesn't take into account is often the types of warfare used by the indigenous tribes of the Americas, like the Cherokee and Shawnee, was restorative justice. Essentially, you go out and you kill an equal amount of people or more, or a little bit more, that you have lost in some transgression, like Logan's family and his village and things like that, and then you leave. And this is why, for example, in the Seminole War, Zachary Taylor, a battle he claims as a victory, was also a battle the Seminole claimed as a victory, for this exact same reason. The Seminole lost only a dozen or so, whereas Zachary Taylor lost a couple of hundred, at least, in the battle. And I don't remember the name of the battle off the top of my head. I do have a video on the Seminole Wars where I mention that in depth, but that's sort of why I take issue with Dunmore claiming he won, because that doesn't take into account the type of warfare these tribes waged. However, regardless of that, after this, Cornstalk and many of the chiefs felt that perhaps poking the bear was, and having even more British soldiers and better trained soldiers march into their territory was not the best idea. Mm-hmm. So they sued for peace. However, despite that being sued for peace, the damage was already done, and many of the colonists began to take issue with this. And this eventually led to one of the most infamous and often overlooked, unless you're indigenous, excerpts from the Declaration of Independence, which is the one highlighted here, where they say, essentially, the crown has has endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless, He has incited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whole, whose known rule of warfare is undignified destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, which, of course, doesn't take into account, and I will mention this in more detail in this video because there are a couple of instances of this, that oftentimes the British in colonial modes of warfare were often more horrific than the indigenous tribes. And so now I'm not going to go into much detail about the Declaration of Independence because we know about it. It's the most talked about document, like Ryan has said. They sent it to the to King George, who, much like the Olive Branch petition, was like, yeah, whatever, and toss it aside. But they sent it there, and that was sort of the quote unquote official start, even though, as we said, the actual start were the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. And this eventually led to the Continental Army laying siege to Boston and forcing the British to actually leave Boston, which was actually a decent victory for them. Mm-hmm. Then we get into the full-scale war. So I've divided this section into two main sections: the northern and western theaters, because the northern theater of the American Revolution is essentially the same thing as the same as the western theater of the American Revolution. Yeah. So the northern theater and the western theater essentially were from roughly Pennsylvania up to Maine, and then into the Ohio Territory, as well as Canada. And the two, during this time, of course this would change, but primarily during this time, the two primary commanders of each side were George Washington and General Howe. Both very skilled commanders in their own right. General Howe, arguably the better commander in many ways, but they were both very skilled commanders in their heart. George Washington had come a long way from being the naive young major who had been caught unawares in the 7 Years' War, and had now, through the 7 Years' War, as well as through being stationed in the Caribbean and such for a short amount of time, had become a skilled commander in his own right. And General Howe sort of made the first move. He first became the New York and New Jersey campaigns, where, with the exception of New Jersey, most of the battles were victories on General Howe's part. He was relentless, and he defeated Washington at every turn. Right. And then also the Pennsylvania theater, which was inconclusive, but again, Howe won quite a lot of victories against Washington. The issue that came with Howe is he had multiple chances to completely wipe out Washington's army, Washington included, and he didn't take them. Right.
Washington kind of knows too, like if he really meets Howe on the battlefield in a pitched European style battle and loses, that's the revolution.
Yeah,
right? Exactly. So he spends a lot of it running away.
Yeah, he spends a lot of it running away, which works to his advantage. Because again, Howe is arguably the better commander. But Washington, that being said, Washington still is a good commander in his own right, and he knows, one, he's from this area, so he knows the territory. I mean, he's from Virginia, but still, he knows the territory very well, having fought in it during the 7 Years' War, and visiting it all the time during the Continental Congresses. So he uses that to his advantage to avoid. And, now, while I am grateful that Washington wasn't wiped out, because without it, I or Ryan or anybody else probably wouldn't be here, looking at purely in a military perspective, Howe should have just taken the chances he had and wiped out Washington. And I'm not saying that as no, we should have lost the war. No, I'm fine with us winning the war. I'm just saying purely from a strategic standpoint, Howe should have taken the chances he had. And that eventually led him to being replaced, specifically by Cornwallis, but we'll get to that in a little while. One of Howe's best best commanders actually was an individual, a Mohawk individual known as Joseph Brant, who had fought in the 7 Years' War on the British side, and he was a very well-known and skilled warrior. And he joined on the side of the British for a variety of reasons, mainly because the British, at least in token sense, tried to keep the colonists from going into indigenous territory. So while he didn't necessarily like the British, they at least were more beneficial than the colonists who were constantly encroaching on his land and ignoring the Proclamation of 1763. And so he made his base of operations, I believe Unadala. No, he made his base of operations, Aguago. I probably butchered that, but he made his base of operations this village right here. And during this time, he come on, go back down. There we go. During this time, he scored quite a few victories. For one, he was with Howe at the Battle of Oriskany, that ended in, really it was a draw, but the British were able to essentially prevent the Continental Army from gaining any ground. And one of the main reasons that happened was because of Brant and his warriors. And then he also burned down various settlements like Cobskill at the Battle of Cobskill, as well as participated in the attack on Germantown, the Cherryville Massacre, and the Battle of Minsk, winning all of these battles for Howe and for Britain, essentially becoming a sort of boogeyman figure for the colonists. Again, while his modes of warfare were brutal, the colonist ones would often be more brutal, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But those are sort of the things he did for General Howe. So while General Howe was fighting Washington personally, Joseph Brant was scoring all these other victories for Howe's campaign, and gaining a reputation as one of his best commanders. In fact, gaining a commission as a colonel. Then we come to, on the other end, Washington. Washington, similar to Howe, had a skilled Haudenosaunee commander named Joseph Louis Cook, also known as Colonel Louis Cook, who was an Oneida. Originally, he was an Abenaki, and he was part African American, so he was actually Afro-Indigenous. Unfortunately, this is the best picture I can find of him, period, that is actually him. Because sometimes when you type in somebody into Google Images trying to find them, it might not always be them. But this is actually him. And he had also fought in the 7 Years' War, and was every bit the skilled war leader that Joseph Brant was. And in fact, because of this war, he and Joseph Brant would become lifelong enemies. And then also we had the Lenape, who at least temporarily were the first tribe to sign an alliance with Washington. However, after the Lenape, also known as the Delaware, after their leader died, many of the elements of the tribe and war leaders of the tribe that had been against the alliance quickly switched sides to the British. So there's that. But Joseph Louis Cook and his Oneida and Tuscarora warriors sided with America. And what this essentially did is split the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at the seams. So it was as much a civil war among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as it was a rebellion. Sorry, it was a rebellion. Rebellions are only revolutions if they succeed. To England. And Joseph Louis Cook participated in quite a lot of battles with Washington. Won the Battle of Trenton, the famous battle that happened after the crossing of the Delaware, where Washington ambushed and defeated a very large contingent of Hessian German soldiers from the province of Hesse, which is on the western part of Germany. At the Battle of Trenton, Joseph Louis Cook participated in this. It should also note that Washington treated the Hessian prisoners with very good respect and fed them and all this thing. So anybody who's saying that there's a conversation on social media to this day because of the Ukraine war that treating war prisoners with respect is not something people back then did. Yes, it is. Just wanted to add that in there just as a small aside. Yes, it is. But anyways, but yes, Joseph Louis Cook was one of the people who helped Washington win this battle, as well as the in the Saratoga campaign, which was sort of the turning point for Washington. And Joseph Louis Cook was one of those warriors who helped win the campaign for him. And because of this victory at Saratoga, we begin to see things really change for Britain with the entrance of France on the side of the Continental Army. And I'll get into that in literally 1 second, but I also want to add, while France was the biggest participant on the side of the Continental Army, it's also important to note the Dutch and the Spanish also sided with the Continental Army. You don't hear that a lot, mainly because they didn't really participate in the primary campaign, so that's not that big of an issue for me. Is the why it's not always not often mentioned. They didn't participate in the primary campaign, so fine. But it's still good to mention that they did participate. But the emissary who was sent to Rochambeau, who also, as I mentioned in my video about the Haitian Revolution, was a guy who performed horrible atrocities against the free slaves in Haiti during the Haitian Revolution. But still, he was the emissary who was sent to Rochambeau to sort of bring him to their side. Now, it is important to note that after this, Washington sort of began only using the Tuscarora and Oneida and various other Indian tribes who had sided with him as scouts, because he didn't trust them in the indigenous tribes after his run-in with Tana Greason 16 years earlier, but he'd still used him. And then after this, because of Joseph Brandt's raids into the continental, into the rebellion and into the borderlands, and after finally gaining the allies out of France, Washington gave permission to General Sullivan to march into into Haudenosaunee territory and cause as much damage as possible. Now, it should be noted, before then, there had been a raid on James Brandt's base by other continental militias. And what had happened there, and this is where I want to bring back that often the colonists' modes of warfare were worse. The Continental Congress, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, told the soldiers making that raid, hey, don't kill children, don't rape women, because even as horrible as these raids by the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawk are, Indians never rape our women or kill our children, so we should at least show them that respect. But the militia ignored them, and after the attack on it, they found several children in the fields and impaled them on their bayonets. Again, the Continental Congress itself said that Indians never raped women or killed children. So I want to, hit that home. And we sort of see this again in Sullivan's campaign, because Sullivan gathers around 4,000 soldiers, including a few Oneida and Tuscarora scouts, of which Joseph Louis Cook might have been part of. There's no way to confirm that. It's certainly possible, but it's also hard to prove. So I'm not going to say 100% whether he was there, because I have no way to prove that, but it's certainly possible he was there. But regardless of whether he was there, Oneida and Tuscarora scouts were, and they marched into this wide swath of territory and burned several thousand cornfields, I think 40 or 60 villages, and various other things. And in fact, despite Sullivan trying to stop certain massacres like had happened previously under the raids on Joseph Brandt's base, oftentimes these massacres would happen. Like, for example, Sullivan said, hey, leave this family alone, this elderly couple alone in this house in the village we just attacked. But after he left, the soldiers promptly forced them back into the house, barred the door, and set the house on fire, and things like that. Mm-hmm. Again, not things that, despite how brutal Joseph Brandt's raids could be, that he or any other indigenous warband did. But because of this, it temporarily stalled the Mohawk war machine. However, this raid had the exact opposite of what Washington wanted. This raid actually endeavored the other four, the Mohawk and the other three members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy who had sided with the British, to fight even harder. So basically all that happened was Joseph Brandt went to Fort Niagara, recuperated, and it did cause Fort Niagara being up here, it did cause a refugee crisis and did cause a famine, but all of this endeavored Joseph Brandt to fight even harder, so the raids actually increased in intensity rather than decreased. So, yet again, showing that Washington didn't actually understand how indigenous warfare worked, or how the British understand how indigenous warfare worked. And then, during this time, eventually, because of this ramping up, Joseph Brandt and Joseph Louis Cook would sort of come to even further of a head, actually fighting each other at the Battle of Clocks Field, ending in a American victory and Joseph Brandt being injured, where he would promptly spend the rest of the war, I believe, out of commission. But Rimmerman, the general who was at that battlefield, didn't give chase, whereas Joseph Louis Cook did. He gave chase across the river, and according to the accounts, because he realized that the Continental forces were not following his own Tuscarora warriors, and he supposedly turned around, pulled out his saber, and yelled across the river, accusing the general of being a Tory. Tories were essentially pacifists and things like that, so he was calling him a coward. I don't know if that's true. I hope it is, because that, to me, just makes Joseph Louis Cook even more of a badass person than he was. And then eventually Joseph Louis Cook, along with Colonel Willett, would defeat British forces under Major Ross and Captain Butler at the Battle of Johnstown. Now we go into the sort of the Western Front. So what a lot of people don't know is that a few Plains tribes actually participated in the Revolutionary War also, specifically the Dakota and Yankton Sioux, who were asked to help the British win the Montreal campaign, which they did. Essentially this, and I believe this is one of the campaigns that involved Benedict Arnold, but I'm not quite sure. I know Benedict Arnold invaded Quebec and won. And no, I have not mentioned Benedict Arnold because there's really not much to mention other than a few minor misunderstandings. The story's essentially true. He broke away from it. His former friend Washington got pissed that he turncoated, and that was it. There was a little nuance, but it was not. Essentially, it was. He wanted a promotion. He didn't get the promotion that he wanted, and he got pissed. And his wife, who had sort of been a British spy the whole time, said, "Hey, why don't you turn against them?" And that was it. That's literally the nuance.
The way it's depicted in the TV series Turn, is pretty much how it goes down.
Yeah, the way that, and
they're
also
pretty accurate with that.
And that also the old PBS cartoon. Was it Liberty Kids, which was a pretty accurate Revolutionary War portrayal too. Yeah, they're all pretty clear. There's sometimes, despite us saying that some of the things are taken out of context about the Revolutionary War, this is one of the exceptions to the rules. It pretty much exactly is what it's described as. Now, people calling in the biggest traitor ever in the history of the U.S., that's a little bit much, but other than that, I'd say, yeah, he was a traitor. There's really no nuance. He wanted a promotion that he didn't get, and then he had a hissy fit and switched sides because of it. Anyways, but the Montreal campaign involved the U.S. trying to take the city of Montreal, and the British, along with various indigenous allies, including the Mohawk and the Dakota Sioux, defeated the Continental Army in 1775 and drove them out of Montreal, effectively, for the most part, taking Canada back. So there's that. And then in the Ohio country, we have the Shawnee. So Cornstalk, the sort of, but not quite, principal chief of the Shawnee Confederacy, had tried his best to be neutral. He, knowing how sort of Dunmore's War went and things like that, that while it was a victory sort of on their part, he didn't want to poke the bear too much. And he tried his best to stay neutral. So did his family. And some Shawnee had gone to war already on the side of the British, but for the most part, he was at least a little bit successful. However, he visited, he went to I'll just for the sake of, the video, he went to an American fort, a fort run by the Continental Congress and Continental Army, sort of to try and reaffirm his neutrality, but the head of the fort captured him. And then eventually when his son came as well, he's trying to figure out what happened. He's like, hey, why is he not come back? He was captured too, and the inhabitants of the fort promptly put Cornstalk and his family and various other emissaries from the Shawnee to death, bringing the Shawnee into the war effort in droves. Again, this was not the complete change, because many Shawnee had already sided with the British, but this was the final death. This was the final nail in the coffin of any kind of neutrality in the Shawnee Nation in this war. They entered, and this included the Miami, who, along with Little Turtle, ambushed Colonel Augustin de la Baume and his soldiers and slaughtered them in 1780. And then around this time, Spain, again, that other often forgotten ally on the American side, it took St. Louis, causing the British to try and retake St. Louis from the Spanish with the help of the Dakota Sioux. However, this time the Spanish won, and it did not go well for the British. They did not retake it, and it was permanently in Spanish hands. Let me go back. Yes, and then came the Broadhead Massacre, where essentially 20 Indians were massacred by Colonel Daniel Broadhead, and then in response, several Shawnee and Miami and other various tribes ambushed him and slaughtered his entire group. They, effectively won that battle for the side of the British. And then we have sort of you hear of the Battle of Yorktown being the quote unquote final battle of the Revolutionary War. Well, it was certainly the battle that solidified that the French and the Continental Congress were essentially going to win. It was not the last battle. The last battles included the battle, Estill's defeat, where Captain Estill was killed. His force of 7, he only had 7 soldiers, and 25 pioneers were killed by the 25 Wyandottes. And then the Battle of Fort Henry, where the Continental Congress defeated the British, and that was the final battle of the war. Mm-hmm. Now we are going to go on to African Americans in the Revolutionary War before we go on to the Southern Front. So one of the fears of the Continental Congress was something going on, Dunmore's proclamation. This happened during, with the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. And essentially he gave a proclamation that any slaves of, any of the enslaved Africans owned by colonists who ran away and joined the British Army would be given their freedom. And it really only lasted from 1775 to 1776, but it gave a lot of these enslaved Africans their freedom, and they actually became some of the most fierce fighters that the British Army had. And then you had, let's see here, was this right? Yeah. And then you had other individuals like Clinton's proclamation, who, he essentially extended Dunmore's proclamation and gave even more enslaved Africans freedom if they joined the British Army. But also on the American side, you had patriots who truly believed in the cause in one way or another, such as Crispus Attucks, who died in was it the siege of Boston, I believe.
Boston Massacre.
Boston Massacre. Thank you. The Boston Massacre. He was really the first rebel to die for the cause, and he became a well-known hero. And then you had Thomas Paris, who I believe, Thomas Paris, who wounded several British soldiers in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And you also had the Rhode Island 1st Regiment, which was the largest regiment in the Continental Congress side that consisted of free blacks and former enslaved Africans, as well as Phyllis Wheatley, who wrote a lot of poems and other inspirational things to help further the Continental Congress's cause, the Revolution's cause. And then, but also the British side had war heroes also. Colonel Titus being this one, who actually led both the Dunmore's quote-unquote Ethiopian regiment, the regiment he called and offered freedom to if they joined the British side, as well as other regiments during the Revolution on the side of the British. So essentially what this is it was a opportunity for enslaved Africans, whether they would be loyalists or patriots, to gain their freedom. And in fact, even at one point, an individual we'll talk about in a little bit, Nathaniel Greene, arguably the South's version of George Washington, decided, despite being a slave owner, maybe we need men, and maybe we shouldn't be shirking away enslaved Africans. Because essentially what had happened first is many of the colonists had sort of snuffed their nose at Dunmore's and Clinton's proclamations, and were like, no, we can never do that. No, that's just going to make things worse. And then eventually George Washington and Nathaniel Greene began realizing beggars can't be choosers. We need men. We've been losing battles because the British won more battles than the Continental Army, period. I argue, like, for example, the War of 1812, I took the time to look up all the battles with confirmed victories for one side or the other, and they were about equal, with maybe like the British having 2 more. But the number of battles somebody wins isn't what counts. It's the quality. And that's why, for example, the War of 1812 was actually a British victory, because all of these strategic victories were performed by the British, and all of the
burning the capital down,
burning the capital and things like that, and taking Camden County and keeping the U.S. Out of the Illinois country and Canada and all things like that. But anyways, so, and that's sort of what happens here, is while the U.S. was losing, the Continental Army was losing more battles than the British, their strategic victories were the ones that were coming out, and that's because they began to realize beggars can't be choosers, and so they began enlisting. That's one of the few things that the movie Patriot gets right, is that they began saying, hey, if you're an enslaved African and you fight for the cause, and if we win, we'll set you free. And that is sort of what happened. Which brings me to the Southern Theater, talking about the movie Patriot, because that's where it's set in. Mm-hmm. So the Southern Theater broadly included battles fought in Maryland, though one could argue some of the battles in Maryland were also part of the Northern Theater, but Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And the 2 major figures in the Southern Theater were General Nathaniel Greene, who was sort of the outranked by George Washington, but again, he was the one who was in charge of the Southern Theater, so you could argue he was the Southern version of George Washington. And General Howe's replacement, General Cornwallis, because General Cornwallis, again, while General Howe was arguably the better commander to George Washington, General Cornwallis was the better commander to General Howe. And much like in the North, many of the most effective fighters on the British side were actually the various indigenous tribes. Again, an individual whom I already did an in-depth video about, Dragon Canoe, as well as one of his key allies, the Muskogee Creek chief McGillivray, were amongst these individuals who came to the British side and fought for them. And with their help, the British were able to take the cities of Savannah and Charleston, as well as Augusta, which I was not able to find any map of, unfortunately, which is strange. But the British, took these cities pretty much without issue. That, one, thanks to their own superior army, but also with the help of the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, and the Choctaw, as well as Shawnee. Also, during this time, the Chickasaw in the what is known as the Old Southwest had made an alliance with the Quapaw tribe in Arkansas, the Chickasaw being in Mississippi and Alabama, and they sort of, like the Shawnee, had tried to stay neutral. They formed a defensive alliance between each other to stay out of the fight. And actually, during that time, they saw an increase of trade between Spain, Britain, France, and the Continental Army to their territory, which helped build their economy. However, Thomas Jefferson began to fear this alliance and sent General George Clark, along with an alliance and a group of allied American Indians known as the Illinois Confederacy, to build Fort Jefferson in Choctaw Territory. And this pissed the Choctaw-Quapaw alliance off immensely. And because, again, much like the Shawnee, their neutrality had been challenged. So the Choctaw and the Quapaw began raiding en masse into colonial territory and laid siege to Fort Jefferson, forcing the Continental Army to leave and only be resettled after the Jackson Purchase. And now we get to sort of the death knell of the American Revolution, which was Nathaniel Greene's sort of strategy, which actually mimicked George Washington's strategy during the campaign battles against General Howe, which is essentially pick your battles and retreat as much as possible. Okay, so movies like The Patriot make a lot of people think that the British were still fighting only in the line formation, whereas the colonists had started using guerrilla warfare. That's not untrue, but it's also important to note the British were doing this too. Neither side, they were both fighting in line formation when the terrain called for it, but when the terrain didn't, they were using scouts and using Indian allies and using guerrilla warfare. Also, the villain of the Patriot movie, Colonel Tarleton, was not as horrible of a person as the movie makes him out to be. Mm-hmm. The one massacre he was maybe implicated in, all the accounts say that essentially what happened is when a shot was fired, his horse bucked. Again, sources on both sides. The horse bucked and he fell off his horse and was knocked out, and the British soldiers were the one who commenced the massacre. And when, in fact, this is such a well-known fact that the guy who played General Tarleton in Patriot during the filming of the movie asked the Revolutionary War historian whom Mel Gibson had deigned to have come on there. He kept asking him, was like, did this happen? Did this happen? And did this happen? And the American Revolutionary War historian said, no, none of this happened. So it's so well known that unless you're Mel Gibson, it didn't happen. The war was generally, again, they both sides treated prisoners with respect because that's what you were expected to do. And also, Francis Marion was was not as important as a lot of propaganda likes to make him out to be. he did have some aspects. He was important in some of these battles, but generally it was Nathaniel Greene who was the one who came up with the strategy that Francis Marion used. And this strategy eventually led to them winning a lot of key battles, including on the Battle of Kings Mountain, where the U.S. I keep saying the U.S. where the Continental Army defeated the British. And eventually, the strategy, this a sort of a strategy that the Romans used against the Carthaginians. In fact, it's known as Fabian Tactics because Fabian was the general who used this tactic against Hannibal during the Carthaginian War, and is what gave Nathaniel Greene the inspiration. Is eventually what led to the War of Attrition that led to Cornwallis being cornered at Yorktown.
Right.
And really, Cornwallis, on paper, if the French hadn't shown up, should have won. However, at this time, the French Armada showed up and prevented him from amassing his fleet. And he had essentially was caught in a pincer movement between the French and the Continental Army, which now included both Nathaniel Greene and George Washington. Which, again, on paper, if the French hadn't been there, Cornwallis probably would have won. But
yeah,
still,
the French fleet and the French forces there also helping Washington on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Rochambeau, as well as various other indigenous allies. And with that, the Battle of Yorktown was won for the Continental Army and the French, and officially, though again not really, but officially ending the Revolutionary War. Yeah, get down there. Yeah. Eventually leading to, after those two final battles I mentioned, that were the actual two final battles in the Northern and Western campaign, to the signing of one of the 90 different treaties of Paris.
Yeah.
Because Treaty of Paris apparently is the people who sign treaties love to use it.
That's what it's like. I tell my kids, it's like today. Do you want to have your conference in I don't know, Pierre, North Dakota, or do you want to have it in Vegas?
Yeah.
Oh, Vegas. Oh, that's why they had all the treaties in Paris.
Paris, yeah, exactly. Well, there's a meme where somebody, like, two guys go back in time, and he's like, "Hey, what's going on right now? The Treaty of Paris is being signed." He's like, "So we're either in 15 yada yada, 16 yada yada," and starts naming off all these dates because history is complicated like that. But essentially, what the Treaty of Paris did was it ceded away all of Britain's lands from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, with some of the land being contested by Spain and U.S. and Britain, including Oregon country, which comes into play much later during the Louisiana Purchase and the Napoleonic Wars. Then, which leads us to the aftermath of the Revolution. So the immediate aftermath of the Revolution is essentially the further screwing over of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, including their allies. So this right here, the 1784 Purchase. So what happened is after winning the war, the Continental Congress basically told the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy who had sided with the British, this is our land now, and forced them out through various treaties. And then eventually in 1792, joining again to the Oneida and Tuscarora, which is here, their allies, the people who were their allies, they forced out and put on reservations and took their land almost immediately. Furthermore, because of this slight, Joseph Brant, Dragging Canoe, McGillivray, Little Turtle, and Blue Jacket, all these people who had fought on the side of the British, got together and formed the Northwest Confederacy. Now, this shows only like the tribes like the Ojibwa, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, Lenape, etc., but included a lot more of the tribes, including the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and the Muscogee Creek as well.
Right.
And
before you go on, I'd like to point out though that, or if you pay attention to the whole video, earlier in the video we show a map of where the Lenape originated at
Yeah.
and now where they're at.
Yes,
And it
yes, and
tells
that's
you a lot.
and thank you for pointing that out because I hadn't intended to bring that up and I had forgot. So yeah, so the Lenape were in Delaware, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, etc., and they had been forced out. Now this was sort of a double-edged sword because one, it forced them to become refugees in the Ohio Territory, but
Right.
it provided much needed allies and much needed, military power to the Northwest Confederacy, as well as to Dragon Canoe's eventual equivalent in the Southeast that he had made with the Shawnee, the Muskogee Creek, and the Choctaws, as many of the Lenape actually migrated into Cherokee territory and as a settlement, not just warriors. They brought families and everything, but increased the population of that territory and provided the fourth wing of Dragon Canoe's Confederacy, as well as one of the many wings of the Northwest Confederacy. And so it actually made these tribes more powerful. And in fact, this had already been sort of happening, but even before the Revolutionary War, because in Dragon Canoe's speech to the council, he mentions, well, what about the Lenape? They've already lost a lot of their territory to the British. We don't want to become like them. Stop it. So the Lenape coming to him was at least in some way symbolic, and I guarantee you he used that. He's like, see, I'm helping these people who are like us, and so it strengthened them. And also, it's again highlights the hypocrisy of early America, well, of America in general, but of early America especially, because while they were saying, hey, we want to model our government after you, which we'll get about in more detail in a minute, we're also screwing you over out of your land. So there is that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also you begin to see, alongside the territory that had been lost in treaties to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, you see the Chickasaw Treaty of 1783, where the Chickasaw were forced to give land to white settlers, leaving them actually vulnerable to raids by Shawnee, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the Cherokee and the Creeks, actually making them eventually not join Dragon Canoe's Confederacy when he started gathering the tribes, as well as the fact that they were getting offered a better deal by the U.S. And things like that. And then also the Treaty of Hopewell, where half of the Cherokee Nation, the half that had actually been neutral, and the half that had signed the Henderson Purchase, the Transylvanian Purchase, signed the Treaty of New Hopewell, where they basically gave away all of this green land right here that hadn't already been settled by white settlers, which is the Blue Land. Actually making more Cherokee mad and making more Cherokee join Dragon Canoe's side, and further galvanizing Dragon Canoe's fears that the colonists would never get to stop, essentially, which he was right.
Right.
Okay. And then, as far as the African Americans go, the British actually lived up to their end of the bargain with Dudmore and Clinton and such, actually exporting, I think, around 100,000 is the eventual total, enslaved Africans to one, Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone Company, where they settled them, and Sierra Leone, where they started their own government, and it's sort of the basis for the eventual idea of exporting enslaved Africans to Liberia that Abraham Lincoln used, as well as exporting many enslaved Africans to Canada, where they founded cities such as New Brunswick, where their descendants live to this day. So it was a very large emancipation that was happening due to the British living up to their end of the bargain. Now, to be fair, for at least a time, so did the new nation in America live up to its bargain, because Washington did give the right to vote to many former slaves. And North Carolina was actually the first new state to give them the right. But eventually, by like 1810, the colonists began to have that whole replacement theory.
That whole thing really just stuck with the Northeast, where you've got like Massachusetts and then some of the others abolishing slavery. Pennsylvania's graduated or gradual emancipation, but in the South, it's greed takes back over
Yeah,
fairly
greed
quickly.
takes back over in the 1810s, and eventually ends that completely. Also, it doesn't help, unfortunately, because it should have had the exact opposite effect, but still, it doesn't help that the Haitian Revolution happened and made people like Thomas Jefferson and such feel that, oh, it's going to happen here, as well as the sort of early versions of the Great Replacement theory. In essence, if we free them, they're going to have more children and outnumber us, uh, kind of thing. Um, and so, yeah, that happened. And again, I have a whole video going in depth about the Haitian Revolution as well as America's part in why Haiti is what it is today, because America is one of the main parts.
Mm-hmm.
And then also something that's also important to note: many lands were actually taken. That would, like, Georgia used to be bigger than it was. At one point, Georgia went all the way to the Mississippi River, with the exception of this part, the Spain part.
Mm-hmm.
And Spain controlled most of Florida. Here, come on, go back to the right spot. Oh yeah, that's why I'm brought Florida. Also, there was an ethnogenesis going on. Essentially, what happened is the enslaved Africans who weren't freed by the Continental Congress or exported by the British began to flee to Florida, as well as many refugees like the Lenape and other indigenous tribes, the Lower Creeks and such,
Mm-hmm.
began to flee into Florida. Now, this is an ethnogenesis that had already begun to happen as the Timucua, the Guali, and the Appalachee began to move into Florida. But this began to increase after the American Revolution and began the ethnogenesis of the Seminole, who had already, again, started to develop with the coming of the Timucua, the Appalachee, and the Wally tribes, as well as the Lower Creeks. But this is where it really began to take off. And the Seminole weren't quite made as a nation yet, but they were well on their way, and that's because of the American Revolution. So while Florida and the tribes in Florida were outside of the revolution and had nothing to do with it overall, with the exception of Spain being part of it, the Seminole actually benefited from it, which is one of the few indigenous tribes who did benefit from it. Now we come to the Articles of Confederation. So, I'll pass this off to Ryan to explain
Yeah.
sort of what the Articles of Confederation were.
So the articles are basically our first form of government, and they're going to last from and really kind of during the war, 1781 until 1789, when we adopt the U.S. Constitution. That's another thing that people usually don't bring up, is that the Constitution was not our first form of government. We were actually a confederacy, and a lot of that goes back into the development of the colonies, because the colonies thought of themselves as really independent states. Like, we say states and we think Georgia, Alabama, but their definition would be like France, England, the Holy Roman Empire. Those are different states, and that's how the 13 states originally saw themselves. They wanted a loose association, and that's the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation had a unicameral legislature, one house. Each state got one vote. To pass anything required 9 out of the 13 to vote. To change the articles required a unanimous vote, which would probably never happen. And the articles were an incredibly weak form of central government, which, if you look at what the colonial governments had rebelled against, it makes perfect sense. It's in a reaction to that centralized form of government that the English had. What ends up happening is that we find this is just unworkable. It can't go. And there develops within the colonial leadership, or the now state leaderships, 2 camps: one that wants a very strong central government, and one that wants to remain like the Articles of Confederation. One of the biggest fears of those Federalists, as they're eventually going to be called, the group that wants the strong central government, is that if things stay as they are, then militarily a European power could pick off the colonies one by one, and just take back over North America. Economically, the Articles were a disaster. Almost as soon as the war is over, you start to see tariff wars in between the different states, and it really puts a huge dent in what should have been kind of a post-war economic boom. By the mid-1780s, we're in what would be called a recession depression. And so the Articles failed in military, or there's the idea that it would fail militarily. It's failing economically. And we have summer of 1787, 1786. I can't remember the date off my head. You have Shays' Rebellion, which is Daniel Shay, who was a veteran of the American Revolution, leads a rebellion of Western farmers that pretty much are upset about all the inabilities of the Articles of Confederation, especially the economics, because these men had been paid in land oftentimes, and then they, of course, mortgaged that land to start their farms, and then with the recession hits, they're wiped out. And so they go after courthouses, to burn down courthouses, and I always get, well, why do they burn down the courthouse? That's where all the records are, right? And so if I have a mortgage and it's in the courthouse and it burns down, okay, prove that I had it with you.
Yeah,
you can't, right? So that's kind of what starts, and as Shays' Rebellion basically kind of morphs into it, or morphs into more as it goes on. And the inability of the Articles of Confederation to do anything about this really raises heads. It literally takes like some rich people from Boston to hire in people, and the Massachusetts Guard to put Shays' Rebellion to an end. But that happening in the summer of I think it's 1787, really highlighted the inabilities of the Articles of Confederation to do anything. And it was basically letters back and forth agreed that they would meet in Philadelphia the next summer to try to figure something out. And that's what leads to what we call the Constitutional Convention, but they call the Philadelphia Convention.
Yeah. And in this, they revive again this whole debate about what to build their new government on, or what to base their new government around. Now, I don't want to take away from the fact that they did look at Rome to a point for inspiration. However, Rome, for one thing, there's a whole myth about democracy and republics not existing after Rome fell. The Roman Republic fell. That's not true. There was the Republic of Venice, the Republic of Milan, the Republic of Florence, etc. All kinds of things. In fact, and also many medieval cities like the Hanseatic League and the Lombard League and things like that were in essence republics in on themselves. So that's not true, and they would have never claimed that back then. However, to claim that Rome was their primary focus is wrong. In fact, Tom Adams, was it Tom Adams, the second president of the U.S. Tom Adams. John Adams. He, in his debate, his speech is entitled "On Government." He looks at, essentially, he says, let's see here. Nothing ought to have more weight with the Americans to determine her judgment against mixing the authority of the one and the few and the many confusedly in one assembly than the widespread miseries and final slavery of almost all mankind in consequences of such ignorant policy in the ancient Germans. So he's looking at the ancient Germans, and then he goes on to collect together the legislation of Indians would take too much room, but would be well worth the pains. The sovereignty is in the nation, and it is true, but the three powers are strong in every tribe. So that's where he's talking about dividing the government into three branches. And their royal and aristocracy, dignities are much more generally hereditary from the popular partiality to particular families, and the superstitious opinion that such are favorites of the god of war than late writers upon the subject have allowed. And then he goes on to say, let's see here. The 50 families would soon dissolve their union, and nothing would ever content them short of complete individual independence of the Mohawks. For it may depend on individual independence is what every unthinking human heart aims at, nearly or remotely. So he's saying this is who we should copy our thing: the Germans, the ancient Germans, and the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We can see this continued by Thomas Jefferson, who says, let's see here, find that we see into what small divisions the Indians are obliged to reduce their societies. This measure with disposition to shut up the Mississippi gives me serious apprehensions of the severance of eastern and western parts of our Confederacy. It might have been made the interests of the Western states to remain united with us by managing their interests honestly and for their own good. So again, you have that he's comparing their government versus with how the indigenous tribes are. And then Thomas Paine, another founding father, says that see here yeah, but for the fact that the condition of millions in every country in Europe is far worse than if they had been born before civilization began, or had been born among the Indians of North America at present day, I will show this fact has happened. And then he goes on to talk about how the indigenous tribes of America have a utopia versus Europe being horrible. So we get this idea from how a lot of modern textbooks through grades K through 12 that they got it from Rome, they got it from etc. When reality, not one, not two, but three different people, including Benjamin Franklin, already having brought it up in the 1750s, as well as the diplomatic meeting between the Constitutional Congress and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in Albany in 1755, all point to they adopted their government and modeled it after both the Germanic tribes, like John Adams mentions, but also the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And we can see this further in this little table right here, showing the various very striking similarities between the Great Law of Peace of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the United States Constitution. Again, it wasn't completely that. They did base it somewhat off of the Roman Republic, because the Roman Republic did have three branches of government to a point. But as I've shown, in the words of the founding fathers themselves, they were specifically looking to the Germanic tribes and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, again, going as far back as 1751, 1775, and the Constitutional Convention, or the Philadelphia Convention.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the omission of that, right?
Yeah.
They focus on the Romans and the Greeks, and that's there, but they never bring in any of the other influences. And that's the problem. And that's a lot of history in U.S. history textbooks, is this basically lying by omission.
Yeah, and a quote I didn't include in there because I really didn't need to, but it's a quote from the Philadelphia Convention where James Madison, another person, says he doesn't mention the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or any quote unquote Indians, but he says European powers cannot be who we base our government off of. He says that very clearly. Mm-hmm. He's like, Europe and England cannot be who we base our government off of. And that will be sourced in the comments in the various letters and speeches from the Constitutional Convention, as well as all the other primary sources I've shown pictures of will be cited as well. So again, they're saying very clearly, no, with the exception of the Germanic Confederacy and a little bit of Rome, we're not basing our government off of anything in Europe. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, even in a later letter in 1787, says that Europe is a den of thieves and pirates. So
yeah, they wanted nothing to do. Europe was old world. Europe
yeah,
was failure.
yeah,
Yeah, this is something new. Yeah.
yeah, and so so again, the people who argue against this hypothesis often say, oh well, maybe they were paying lip service. Okay, well that's fine if you look at just the meeting between the Constitutional Congress and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in 1775. But all of these sources I've shown are not speeches to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They're debates between each other in the Constitutional Convention. So to claim that it is paying lip service makes no sense because they were all talking to each other, rich white men in the former colonies of England.
Right.
So, yeah, uh, sorry to people who are racist against the indigenous Americans. We have the Haudenosaunee, more commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, but more properly known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to thank for the creation of our current government. And in fact, the Congress in 1988 acknowledged this in a public speech that they did. We do have them to thank. That was definitely paying lip service, but again, we have a lot of evidence pointing to this. And again, as the people who come up with this hypothesis said, no, this is not the only inspiration or the only thing they base it off of, but is a inspiration that is key and has not been mentioned enough.
Right.
So, and then we come into the presidencies of George Washington, and John Adams. Now, we already talked about the presidency of George Washington in our very first video, the Trail of Tears video, and we go into it in a decent amount of depth. It's essentially what everything we mentioned in that video, and I will link it in the iCard. Essentially, his presidency was, for the most part, a success, with the exception of the Whiskey Rebellion, and the disaster that he caused with the Northwest War against the Northwest Confederacy, because George Washington, at least nominally, did try to maintain peace between the indigenous tribes and the United States, but only because he couldn't afford the country at the time, which had a small army, making a lot of enemies. But when the war was beginning, like when it was looking like there was going to be war between the Northwest Confederacy and the U.S., Congress was like, hey, we can still solve this civilly. Don't be too brash, you jackass. And then he sent Harmer in, General Harmer, who essentially ignited the war. Again, not understanding how indigenous warfare or indigenous politics worked. But again, we already mentioned that it's important that I bring it up in summary. But we mentioned in more detail in the first video that I will link in the iCard. What I wanted to focus on is John Adams' presidency, which arguably had more effect with the XYZ affair, which I will pass off to Ryan to talk about.
Oh gosh. So in a nutshell,
Yeah.
this goes back to 1789 and the over here in the United States, we have the adoption of the Constitution, the election of George Washington, and we start on. But in Europe, it's significant because it's the beginning of the French Revolution, and which is one of the most significant events in European history. Some people would argue probably the most significant event.
I'm one of those who argues that. Yeah.
Yeah, it just unleashed a whole box of Pandora's box of stuff.
I would argue that it and the Haitian Revolution should be the focus of the Age of Revolution, not the U.S., but whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the French Revolution has Europe, basically all the rest of Europe, who are monarchies, fighting against the revolutionary France, and that puts the baby United States, which is kind of like a backwater, what today we would refer to as lower economic country, in a bit of a bind, because the United States wants to trade with everyone, And of course, the British don't want us trading with the French, and the French don't want us trading with the British, and vice versa. And that sets up a real foreign policy issue from Washington all the way to Madison. The first four presidents are all dealing with the fallout of the French Revolution. And so in Adams' presidency, we have this thing where we're kind of at war with the French, but not really. We haven't really declared war. They're stopping our ships just as much as the British are. And this, that's one of the big things with the War of 1812 is this stopping of trade ships and the impressment of sailors, which is more about them taking our stuff than the sailors.
Yeah.
But we play that up. And so the French are doing the exact same thing. All right. And so we send representatives over there, and Adams sends representatives over to negotiate this peace. Gosh, I'm leaving out a whole part about how bad Alexander Hamilton is during this.
Yeah.
Hamilton is actually pushing for war with the French.
Yeah.
So that he can then use the army that he is building to basically wipe out Thomas Jefferson and everybody that follows Thomas Jefferson. He wanted to arrest all the Jeffersonian Republicans, and he was going to use this to do it. That's kind of like the Alien and Sedition Acts as part of that whole thing.
Yeah.
And so Adams was pretty much ignored for most of U.S. history.
Yeah.
Kind of gets a little bit of a rebirth in the 80s and 90s because he bucks against the powerful Alexander Hamilton and seeks to negotiate some sort of a truce with him. But here it kind of backfires because Americans are not used to how diplomacy works in Europe.
Yeah.
And in diplomacy, you're supposed to grease the wheels of diplomacy per se.
Yeah.
And so three French officials come out and meet the Americans. And before they could see the foreign minister, Talleyrand, they ask basically for a bribe. And the Americans get hugely offended and storm out. They never caught the actual names of the three French officials, which is why they're referred to as X, Y, and Z. Right?
Yeah.
And so this really kind of blows everything up. It helps Hamilton's cause because you've got all the battle drums and the sabers rattling on Hamilton's side, and Adams is in kind of a problem here.
Yeah. And also another interesting fact: George Washington, at least temporarily, thought about coming out of retirement to lead the war effort. So there is that too. He didn't really play a big part, but he at least thought about it.
Yeah.
So there's that. And so the final thing that affected the aftermath of the American Revolution had, sort of, was the what is called the Age of Revolution, where the American Revolution, again, sort of, and I'll get to that in a second, kicked off or inspired all these other revolutions across the Atlantic world. Like especially in South America with the forming of the Republic of Colombia, also known as Grand Colombe, as well as the Haitian Rebellion, as well as rebellions in Europe, and also a little bit in India as well. Where I take issue with America, with the American Revolution being the catalyst for the American Revolution, is it doesn't take into account that several revolutions had sort of already begun to happen in Haiti, as well as all of the other issues happening in Europe at the time too, that eventually led to the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution, while America had some of an effect on it, and it was already sort of brewing because Louis the I want to say fifth, Louis the 14th, Louis the 15th. Correct. Louis the 15th was the Sun King.
I'm a U.S. history guy.
Yeah. Louis the 15th was Uh, he was bad. He was known as the Sun King, and basically, um, the palace. He built an extravagant palace, and basically built it on the backs of uh, the labor of the peasants. And then his son Louis the 16th had inherited that, plus the American Revolution, and he began to tax the peasants even more and cause the revolution. And then the Haitian Revolution had already been brewing for a while because of how slaves have been treated. In fact, there had been earlier revolutions that had sort of been the catalyst for the Haitian Revolution. So, furthermore, the Haitian Revolution actually ended in a revolution, ending in full equality for enslaved Africans and things like that, and became actually for a while a pretty powerful republic. It provided aid to Simon Bolivar, the individual whom Bolivia is named after, and who was one of, not the only one, but one of the leaders of these revolutions in South America, as well as inspiring the Greek rebellion over here against the Ottomans, and providing aid to them as well. So we have this. The American Revolution was certainly influential, but the Haitian Revolution was far more influential. And again, so was the French Revolution, because while it was a failure horribly, because Napoleon took power. I don't want to say almost immediately, but pretty quickly. He took power pretty quickly.
Yeah, the Committee for Public Safety and Robespierre screwed the French Revolution. Big time.
And Napoleon was already a pretty powerful general in his own right, and so when he took power as the sort of supreme commander of the French military, he pretty quickly took power for himself and declared himself emperor. And again, it had a massive influence too, because it influenced the War of 1812. It also influenced the Greek Revolution. It influenced the formation of the eventual modern state of Italy. It influenced the formation of the Germanic Confederation, and eventually the German Empire, and things like that. So, the American Revolution is sort of the start of the Age of Revolution, but it's not the most important of the revolutions.
And we talked about this before, though, but the American Revolution is not compared to, like, there's no social aspect.
Yeah.
There's no economic aspect. It's just a political revolution, and that was it.
Yeah, and that was it, exactly. And really, none of the European powers cared. They were just like, yeah, whatever. The Monroe Doctrine's a prime example. We are the ones in charge of the West. Yeah, whatever, dude. And then until Theodore Roosevelt came along, nobody cared, and Europe continued to meddle in the affairs well after. So,
right.
So essentially with that, oh yes, there you go. And also the effect it had on the tribes of the Southeast. Again, with this ethnogenesis of the Seminole, but also it eventually sort of led to the development of the five tribes. One, because they, for example, the Cherokee and the Muskogee Creek and the Choctaw and the Shawnee fought America to a standstill in the Cherokee-American War. You see, if you look it up on Wikipedia, the Wikipedia article and all the other sources claim it was a quote-unquote American victory. But if you look at how the war actually went, it was more like the Korean War. Essentially, it was 20 years of nonstop warfare, and then eventually, like, we're done. No one's gained anything. We're done. But because of this warfare, these five tribes rose out of the ashes of all the other tribes that had been there, the Natchez, the Quapaw, etc., and became the dominant powers
right.
on the thing. And again, it was the ethnogenesis, the sort of beginning of the increase of the ethnogenesis of the Seminole Nation. Okay, and so with that ends our video. So as you can see, the American Revolution is far more complex than any textbook says, and even then, if you that's only
we covered some in this video that isn't in textbooks, but not nearly all of it.
No, And you know,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that, you know, if you have a good history teacher like Ryan over here, who, you know, still, as he said before, is still hampered by curriculum and things like that, but even he still brings up these subjects as much as he can. So if you have a good teacher, that's still, you can still get around that. But as we've seen with
Yeah.
like what's going on in Arizona, which for I'm actually sort of on the fence about for a couple of reasons, but still, the U.S. The teachers don't always know to look for these or don't always care.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
thank you for saying that, and Florida too, right? So in
yeah,
Florida, we're seeing a push to go back to an earlier historiography that omits pretty
yeah,
much a lot of what we were talking about. Any sort of Native American influence or
mm,
African American influence will be
yeah,
totally omitted through this
yeah,
anti-woke bill that DeSantis has pushed through down there.
yeah,
It's scary times.
yeah. Now on the Arizona thing, again, I'm on the fence about that one because part of it is many of this got missing 5,000 teachers quit, and a lot of those jobs were already being filled by substitute teachers anyway, who are getting paid half the pay. So I can understand them being paid the full money for the job they're already doing, but at the same time, education is very important in teaching these subjects. So,
Right.
so that's why I'm on the fence about that. But the Arizona thing's not as bad as what DeSantis and Georgia and such are doing. The Arizona
Right.
thing is much, again, there's nuance there that should be discussed. So,
Yeah, and I'm starting my 23rd year of teaching, and I've run into a lot of people who have come from the business field into education.
yeah,
And I know it's anecdotal evidence, but um, most of them don't last.
yeah,
Many of them don't last a semester. I mean, I know of at least three off the top of my head that quit by Thanksgiving,
yeah,
right? So you've got that aspect to it too.
yeah,
You have to
exactly.
have the training and you have to have the personality.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Yeah. And so going back on the Arizona thing, I think, you know, while that's good, giving the substitute teachers their due, they should also, the only caveat should be you should be going to school and getting this training in the middle of that, which is like a
right.
way around that. But, anyways, but yeah, but so that's a lot of the issues why you don't, all the things we mentioned in here aren't getting mentioned. So there are good teachers like Denison are doing that, and people like me doing the YouTube video with history degrees and archaeology degrees. But there's, you know, you don't often hear about that, and so you know, the nuances and the complexities of the American Revolution, like for example, you know, the idea of taxation without representation, which in reality the colonies had more representation than a lot of places, as well as the higher ups of the colonies wanting more land and money, are lost. So it's both, you see this sort of dichotomy going on in the social media, where some people are like, "Oh, it was just rich people wanting to get out of the purview of the British government. Oh, it was taxation without representation, and there's no in between." When it's like it was very much the in between that we're seeing in actual history. So, and so with that, we'll end the video, and you know, just leave that these thoughts to those watching, uh, to understand that there's definitely a lot of nuance that needs to be brought back into schools, and why we did this video. And we hope you liked the video, and remember to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to see us cover any other subjects in the future, feel free to leave a comment. Keep tuned for the long-awaited reconstruction video that we have plans to do very soon as well. And have a good day. Oh, and thank you to Ryan, as always, for coming on.
Oh, thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
you're very
Appreciate it.
welcome. Yeah.